The first question comes from Marcy on Twitter. She refers to Jeremiah 29:11. She says, is this a promise for Israel? She says this is a promise for Israel, but can't it not be applied to us as far as God does have plans for us, or is that out of context?
Well, I get this question a lot, Melinda, and that verse does not teach that God has plans for us. That verse is talking about a very particular plan that God has for Israel that is tied to his covenant. And when you read the larger context there, this is a letter written to the leadership of Israel who are in Babylon, actually, being disciplined for their disobedience of years and years and years running, disobedience to the covenant. When God says, I know the plans I have for you, he is not just referring to ideas in his mind that he's going to do sometime. He's referring to a promise and a plan that he has already made to them. And actually, the language of that goes back to Deuteronomy 29 or maybe 30, where he promises punishment, blessings for obedience, and punishment for disobedience for Israel. It's a conditional covenant, the Mosaic covenant. So he's going to detail how this covenant is working out. Does God have plans for Christians? Well, sure, but that verse isn't talking about that. And so even if the language could be used to describe things that are true about Christians, it might be, right sermon, wrong verse. I don't want Christians jumping into passages that weren't intended for them and start hijacking this language and applying it to them with that kind of rationale because, first of all, it's misrepresenting the passage. It does not have any divine authority if you misrepresent the meaning of the passage, okay? If there's something true being said there of Christians, but the passage isn't saying it, it's better to use a verse that is talking about that. I will never leave you or forsake you even unto the end of the age or something. That would be the way of using that passage. Not just isolating this passage and saying, well, God has plans for me. That isn't what the passage is teaching. The other problem with that is there are different things that God says in that passage through Jeremiah about plans he has for the Jews. One group is in Babylon who's obeyed the prophets and gone into captivity. The other group is there in Jerusalem who have not obeyed the prophets and instead had false prophets they followed. And 2 verses later, God says, I got some plans for you too, and they are not for prosperity. They are for judgment, and here it comes. And then you read on, wow, there's actually 2 promises here. So if we're going to claim a promise, which one do we claim? Both of these are promises for God's people, so to speak. No, that's just a hazardous way of going about it. The best way to exegete a passage like that for Christians is you have to go from Israel to God and then God down to us. That means, what does this interaction that God is having with Israel and this disciplinary action and this encouragement that we see during this captivity time, what does it say about God? And then what is the right way then to apply what it tells us about God to our lives here? So I don't think it teaches the passage that God has plans for prosperity for all of his people. The passage doesn't teach that. He has plans for judgment for some of his people, or even in the same passage. I think it teaches that God is faithful to his promises and to his covenants, and this is an outworking of the covenant right there. And so whatever covenants God has with us, like the new covenant, he's going to be faithful to us in that as well. So that, I think, is the right application of that, Melinda, not the way most people want to go about that. Doesn't God have plans for us? Well, see, this applies to me. Yes, no.
So even though we can learn from other passages that God has plans for us, that's not something we can take from that passage. And you're saying that what we can take is a more general understanding of God's keeping his covenant with whoever he's made those covenants with.
That's right. That, I think, is the appropriate application for the Christian. And if you want to seize on God's plans for a future and a hope, that was physical prosperity, by the way, because it explains it right there. I'll bring you back. I'll restore your fortunes. Well, God doesn't promise physical prosperity for us. He promises the opposite for us in the New Testament. This is another problem with taking it that way. The promise in the New Testament is suffering and hardship. First Peter, Hebrews, First and Second Thessalonians, all throughout. So in this world you have tribulation. So there's
I don't
kind
like
of
those promises.
yeah. Well, I understand that. I'm sympathetic there, but there you have it.